All right. Well, you have found Teacher Talk with Vernon. My name is Vernon. I am a Bible teacher. God called me to teach about 34 years ago, and I've been studying and teaching the Bible ever since. And we have this channel where we meet weekly and we study the Word of God. And my mission, my God-given mission, is to make the Bible understandable to people and to make God's people understand the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So we are in the middle of a study of Ruth right now, the book of Ruth in the Old Testament, and we are about to start on chapter 3. So now that Ruth, by the way, if you haven't seen this study from the beginning, please go back to the first one. Otherwise, you're going to be totally confused. But for those of you that have been watching, now that Ruth has received promises from Boaz, she's enjoying new spirit of optimism in the land. She has this new land that she has come to. She is from Moab. She pledged to be with Naomi, her mother-in-law. So she came back home to Israel with Naomi. And now she has a grant of provision and protection and privilege from Boaz. So she has every reason to be optimistic. And she just enjoyed a full meal, probably for the first time in a very long time. But as we said last week, these two individuals are moving forward without Naomi, or, well, seemingly without Naomi. While Ruth has benefited from Boaz's kindness, Naomi was not a part of that covenant with Boaz. But still, Ruth has attached herself to Naomi. She's pledged the same things that she's getting from Boaz. She's pledged those things to Naomi. So Naomi's opportunity for rest is closely connected to Ruth's situation. And speaking of Ruth and Boaz, there's an interesting relationship, to say the least. He's committed himself to Ruth, but what are his intentions? Single men don't establish this kind of covenant with single women casually. So clearly Boaz has his eye on Ruth, but he's given no indication of intending to move forward. So we're searching to understand why Boaz hasn't taken another step. And in chapter 2, verse 14, we learned that Boaz had concluded their meeting with a covenant meal. We're going to go back to that point and start there. So Ruth chapter 2, verse 14 says, "At mealtime, Boaz said to her, 'Come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar.' So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left." Ruth 2:15 says, "When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servant, saying, 'Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Also, you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles, and leave it, so that she may glean, and do not rebuke her.' So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied." So let's look at this. After this covenant ritual, Boaz invites Ruth to eat roasted grain. Now, the first thing we need to notice is that Boaz served Ruth, but he had just made Ruth a servant in his home. So this is surprising, to say the least, that the master of the house would be serving one of his servants. But I know Ruth was shocked. Probably the other servants that were witnessing this were a little surprised too. But I suspect that he was known as a man of kindness and compassion, and this was his habit, to be considerate towards those who were less fortunate. So next we see that he honors her as well with a huge portion of grain, so much that she couldn't even eat it all. She had some left over. You remember the story in Genesis where Joseph invites his brothers to eat at his table in Egypt, and he purposely reversed the norms of his day by giving the youngest son, Benjamin, far more food than he gave the rest of the older brothers. And Joseph did that to test his brothers' hearts, to see if they would be jealous of their younger brother's good fortune. Kind of in the same way, Boaz gave Ruth this excess portion for a reason. it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a milk miscalculation. It wasn't, that he grabbed the wrong size spoon or scoop or whatever. He's working behind the scenes to bless Naomi as well. He expects Ruth to take the excess and share it with her mother-in-law. But here again, notice how quietly he does his work. He's working through Ruth to bless Naomi. He could have told Ruth, go get Naomi and bring her here. But instead, he leaves it to Ruth to transfer this blessing to Naomi. So immediately, Boaz begins to fulfill his promises to protect Ruth. She's given shelter for the night in Boaz's home, probably in the maid's quarters. Number one, it was too late in the day for Ruth to walk back to Naomi. She would have been walking at dark before she got there, and that was dangerous. And since Boaz had assured Ruth of safety, he couldn't let her leave. So then when she got up the next morning to go back into the fields to continue her gleaning work, Boaz fulfills his promise to provide for her. First, he directs his reapers to keep an eye out for this woman as she works. In verse 15, he tells his servants to allow Ruth freedom to work in the field as she collects the leavings. That will make sure that nobody inhibits her work. Workers could sometimes compete for the best place in the field as they went about their gleaning, and consideration is usually the first casualty. That goes right out the window. Or a lot of people, some people would find a beggar, a beggar, no matter how beautiful or young she was, to be a nuisance who gets in their way. They would just push her out of the way and say, go somewhere else, or, whatever. So Boaz is ensuring that the servants know that Ruth has equal right to be in the field. She has his blessing to be in the field. But he goes a step further and he gives Ruth an advantage in her work. Now, remember, the law allowed widows to glean where the reaping had already happened and in the standing grain in the corners of the field. That's the only place they could be. So they could get the leftovers. That would give a woman enough to eat daily, but it wasn't easy work and it wasn't particularly fulfilling. You would have to bend over all day picking through the old stalks on the ground to find a good one, here or there. And you are competing with other widows. But for Ruth, Boaz tells his servants that she is welcome to glean in the standing grain even before it's been cut down by the reapers. Wow, now it's going to be a lot easier for Ruth to gather grain. Now she's guaranteed to find success and plenty of it every day. In fact, the servants probably had to encourage her to go into the standing grain because it was so against the rules. She probably wouldn't have done it on her own unless the servants had encouraged her and said, no, the master says you can do this. But see, that's the point. Boaz is fulfilling his promise to provide for her and secure her rest. He's almost doing the work for her, or at least he's making it easier for her to do it. Now, from her perspective, she's put in the time and the effort. She's seeing a reward. But in reality, she's being carried along by Boaz's kindness, experiencing a degree of success far beyond her own abilities. Now, Boaz has taken away her worry. He's taken away her uncertainty. He's taken away her fear, but not her need to serve in the work. She's still going to work, but the work's going to be easier and the rewards are going to be greater, and she has no fear of failure. She knows she's going to get enough food every day. So Boaz is blessing Ruth behind the scenes, making these accommodations without taking away her dignity in the process. But what a joy this work is going to be for Ruth. Then he goes a bit further. He tells his servants to purposely pull out some of the grain previously collected and bound up by the gleaners and leave it for her. So they were to kind of secretly, scatter this grain on the ground where it would be easily found by Ruth. So again, Boaz is going well beyond anything required to help her in the gleaning, but he's doing it without leading her to feel uncomfortable because of his charity. So each day for about 6 weeks, Ruth goes out into the fields and enjoys this bountiful harvest. It'd be like a fisherman going out day after day. No matter where he drops his hook, he catches something every single time. She must have looked forward to each day of work. And it was probably still hard work, but it was rewarding all the same. And each day brought its own reward. So you remember last week, we said that Boaz pictured the Lord's call for us to serve him. Here we see again how Boaz pictures what it's like to work for Jesus. Ruth's work in the field is a picture of the church working to serve the Lord, who brought us into a relationship through his covenant in the first place. He called us all to serve him, and he told us the work would be easy and joyful. Now, Ruth saw her work achieve unexpected bounty. It's going to be the same serving the Lord. You and I have been called to make Christ's priorities our priorities, to work in his field, not in somebody else's field. And he says if we devote ourselves to that pursuit, it'll be easy work. So, okay, what kind of work are we talking about? Well, literally anything and everything. It's not just people in full-time ministry or missionaries or even church volunteers. We're talking about mothers who serve Christ in the home, fathers who serve Christ leading their families, godly children representing Christ in their schools, godly men and women representing Christ in all levels of society, funding ministries with their personal resources, praying for the needs of others, giving time and attention to those who are lonely or hurting, serving in the work the Lord has assigned to each of us. And as we do this work, the Lord is preparing the field to ensure that we are going to reap some kind of harvest. And he literally instructs his servants to help us. Just as Boaz's servants followed Ruth around and made her work easier, so do the Lord's servants. You say, well, what servants are you talking about, Vernon? Well, who does Jesus have following us, throwing grain in our path, so to speak? The writer of Hebrews says that the Lord's angels were created for this very purpose. Speaking of angels, in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, the Word of God says, are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? The angelic realm is working behind the scenes to make sure our work is productive and easy, to ensure that we gain results far beyond what we could accomplish on our own. And just as Boaz's servants helped Ruth without her knowing it, angels work outside our notice as well. We can't see them. We can't even see how they work, but we can see the result. When you step out to serve Christ, when you make a commitment to follow his word or take on some new challenge that he's put on your heart, expect him to show up. You're not going to see the help coming before you take that step, and you may hesitate to take that step because you can't see it. But that's why we call it faith. Like Ruth, there could be no gathering unless and until she entered the field. Ruth couldn't see the miraculous provision of Boaz's grace by staying in the house. She had to begin the work. When the Israelites were crossing the Jordan into the Promised Land, the priests were in front of the procession with the Ark of the Covenant. And God said, I'll make a way. And they could have stood there all day, and that River Jordan would have been rushing right in front of them. They had to take that step of faith. When the Bible says when they dipped their feet in the water, the Lord parted the waters. But not until they took that step of faith. So we have to test the Lord to see if he won't keep his promise to make the work fruitful. And it'll still be work, but it's going to be a joy. So we can see the impact of Boaz's grace on Ruth's first day of harvest. In verse 17, we're told that Ruth collects an ephah of grain. Now, an ephah is roughly a bushel or about 35 liters. That's about 46 pounds of barley grain. She probably had trouble getting it home. In fact, that's probably why she stopped with one bushel, because she couldn't carry anymore. I don't know what the average widow would normally collect on an average day scavenging in the field, but I can guarantee you it was a lot less than 46 pounds. So Naomi, of course, was overwhelmed when she saw what Ruth drug in the house. Naomi had probably been praying just to receive just a small sack of grain, maybe enough for a meal for the two of them. Instead, Ruth appears with weeks and weeks worth of food. And she also brings the leftover boiled grain from the previous night's dinner. So not only does Naomi have a measure of security in the raw grain, but she also received the immediate joy of a meal. She didn't even have to cook dinner. So Ruth has fulfilled her pledge to be a blessing to Naomi. She accomplished it because Boaz fulfilled his pledge to be a blessing to Ruth. And that's true because Boaz is related to Naomi and in covenant with Ruth. So we can say that Boaz was the means to both women receiving a blessing. So then we see Naomi's reaction. Verse 19 of chapter 2, her mother-in-law then said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The name of the man with whom I worked today is Boaz." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead." And then again, Naomi said to her, "The man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives." So Naomi sees all this grain. She asks the obvious questions. Where did you get this? Where did you work? How did you get this much grain? This is unreal. And Naomi understood immediately there was no way that Ruth could get that much grain under normal circumstances. So something unusual must have happened. So Ruth tells Naomi the story. And when she reveals the man's name, Naomi's eyes must have lit up. She recognized the name of Boaz. He's a member of Naomi's extended family. So Naomi responds in praise to the Lord. She says, "May the Lord bless Boaz for what he's done." Then she praises the Lord, saying that the Lord has not withdrawn his kindness from the living and the dead. And she's speaking of the wombs of these two women, of herself and Ruth. The living refers to Ruth, and the dead refers to Naomi. Ruth has a living womb in the sense that she is still young enough to produce children. Now, producing children was a woman's lifeline in those days. An eligible woman who could produce children was still likely to find a husband because a man's posterity was tied to his children. So in that sense, Ruth is the living because she can bring life into the world. Likewise, Naomi is the dead because she is past childbearing years. She knows that she has zero prospect of ever being married again, much less having children, which made her all the more desperate and vulnerable and probably fearful. But now at this moment, Naomi sees the Lord is working to care for both of them through Boaz's kindness. Now it's obvious that the Lord is working to care for Ruth. But when Naomi sees the leftover grain from dinner, she knows that Boaz is thinking of her too. This is all the more credit to Boaz. It's obvious why Boaz might have an interest in showing kindness to a young, pretty, unmarried woman like Ruth. That's a no-brainer. But to extend his kindness through Ruth to Naomi is another thing altogether. It says he's truly desiring to do the Lord's work and show mercy and kindness to the less fortunate. Now, Naomi tells Ruth at the end of verse 20 that Boaz is one of their closest relatives, which leads Ruth to tell Naomi more of the story. So in verse 21, it says, "Then Ruth the Moabitess said, furthermore, he said to me, you should stay close to my servants until they have finished all my harvest." Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his maids, so that others do not fall upon you in another field." So she stayed by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now Ruth says Boaz has instructed her to remain in the field until the end of the harvest, to which Naomi gives the most obvious advice that any mother-in-law has ever given. Naomi tells Ruth, you should definitely stay there. Not only is it going to ensure a good provision for both of them, but Naomi expresses concern for what would happen to Ruth if she wandered into another property. Remember, this is the time of the judges. People did what was right in their own eyes. All through history, women have always been victimized by evil men. But it was almost worse in this time because, again, people did what was right in their own eyes. They had no regard for doing the right thing. So Ruth stays close to Boaz throughout the barley harvest and up to the next harvest. Now, a little side note, barley is harvested in the spring right around Passover. Wheat is harvested about 6 weeks later. So Ruth works in Boaz's field for a season or so until the second harvest. But all that while, she stayed with her mother-in-law. Naomi's probably staying on her ancestral land. It hasn't been inhabited for 10 years. It hasn't been farmed. Some of the buildings were probably still standing, so, they had a roof over their heads, but they depend on Ruth's working in the fields for sustenance. It provides enough grain to live on, and it also became a source of income. They could sell the excess grain, make a little bit of money. So for a season, Ruth has the joy of working in Boaz's field. For a season, Ruth is blessed with protection and provision. And during that same season, Naomi is blessed as well, though from a distance. But the harvest doesn't last forever. So Naomi, foreseeing the harvest time drawing to a close, begins to plan for what will happen next. She knows that Boaz has made a commitment to Ruth, but not to her. So she begins to help Ruth cement this relationship. And her plan centers on Boaz's connection to Naomi as a kinsman. Chapter 3, verse 1 says, Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maids you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do. She said to her, All that you say, I will do. So Naomi starts by telling Ruth she wants to seek for Naomi to have a more secure, or she wants to seek for Ruth to have a more secure future. And she's not strictly talking about financial security, although that is part of it, but she's talking about obtaining a husband for Ruth. And this is a twofold strategy on Naomi's part. Firstly, she wants Ruth to have a security that only a husband could provide in that day and age. But secondly, she knows that if Ruth obtains the security of a husband, it will ultimately benefit Naomi as well. So she says to Ruth, Boaz is our kinsman. Now, we've been kind of tiptoeing around this term ever since we started this, and we need to explain the significance of this term. It's a legal term, and it's from the law of Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 25 and 26, the law provides another mercy for a widow. Just like the law that required that widows had a way to provide for themselves, this law ensured a posterity for the tribes of Israel. This is what it says, Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 and 6. When brothers live together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So, this is what it's saying. If a married man dies before he produces a male heir, the widow of the dead man is given a means to ensure his family name lives on. The law required that the unmarried brother of the dead man marry his brother's widow. Then the first male son produced from that marriage would technically be considered the offspring of the dead man, and when that son was an adult, he would inherit the estate of his deceased father and continue the family name. Now, the purpose of this law was twofold. First, it provided a second chance for the widowed woman to gain the security and the rest of a husband and a son. But secondly, it ensured that the dead man's family name wasn't cut off from among the tribes of Israel. The family name didn't die out. The name given to the man who redeems his brother's widow is a kinsman or a kinsman redeemer. This is Ruth's situation. Ruth married a Jewish man. He later died without a son. So she should be redeemed by her deceased husband's brother. But wait a minute, her husband's brother has also died. So the law requires the nearest unmarried male relative to assume the duty for Ruth. And Naomi's thinking of this very requirement on one evening at the end of the barley harvest. And she gives Ruth womanly advice on how to trigger Boaz to do the right thing by Ruth. So next time, we're going to look at Naomi's advice and what Naomi expected to see happen. And then we're also going to go back and touch on the prophetic significance of what's happening and see how it relates to Christ and his church. So I hope you were blessed by this lesson. Until next time, I hope God blesses you, and we will see you next time on Teacher Talk with Vernon.